So my name is Hao Sen Chong. I'm the climate campaigner at the Toronto Environmental Alliance. We greatly appreciate you coming to our webinar today. Our webinar today is how Ontario cities can quit gas. We have 5 people here, including myself, who will be presenting. And what I'll do is I'll just go through folks alphabetically by their first name, and they can introduce themselves. So Irene.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm Irene Whttaker, and I'm the Executive Director of Ecology Ottawa.
Derek Coronado.
Hi, I'm Derek Coronado. I'm the coordinator of the Citizens Environmental Alliance of Southwestern Ontario in Windsor.
Ian Borsick.
Hey everyone, I'm Ian Borsick. I'm the interim executive director at Environment Hamilton.
And Jack Gibbons.
Hi, I'm Jack Gibbons. I'm chair of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, and we're based in Toronto.
This group together, we are forming together the Urban Climate Alliance, and I would invite Derek to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks. As Hao Sen mentioned, the webinar has been organized by the Urban Climate Alliance with financial support provided by the ECHO Foundation. And the Alliance is a network of 4 Ontario-based municipal environmental organizations working to advance climate action at the city level. And just once again, the members include Ecology Ottawa, Toronto Environmental Alliance, Environment Hamilton, and Citizens Environmental Alliance of Southwestern Ontario in Windsor. The Alliance has been active for almost 10 years, and we'd like to especially thank the ECHO Foundation for their continued financial support. Thanks.
Irene has a little bit on just have some housekeeping.
For today's agenda, you can expect to hear a few different things that are very topical, timely, and critical, plainly. So first of all, you'll be hearing about fossil gas and how it's used in Southern Ontario, including use in buildings and in industry. Hear more about Doug Ford's provincial gas plan, who benefits from increased gas-fired generation, cleaner and lower cost alternatives, and how we can stop new gas plants and also the expansion of existing gas plants. We'll save a good amount of time for questions at the end as well, so that we get some dialogue going. Please ask questions. You can pop them into the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time at the end. And the chat is disabled for today, so you can sit back and enjoy and focus on the speakers and just share any questions in that Q&A box. And then just on the next slide, I'll say a couple of thank yous and then we'll get right into it. So wanted to thank each of you for being here. Thanks so much for participating and also for caring about this issue that brings us all here to this place together. So thank you for that. Thanks to all of the partners of the Urban Climate Alliance, which you just heard about from Derek. A special thank you to Jack Gibbons for joining us from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. Really looking forward to hearing from you today. And thank you again to ECHO Foundation for their support in making this possible. So I hope you really enjoy the conversation today.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about fossil gas and how it's used in Southern Ontario. So fossil gas is oftentimes referred to by marketing terms as natural gas. It's primarily methane with small bits of other types of chemicals and other types of gas, but it's a significant greenhouse gas. And it is so significant that a lot of, it's so significant that it actually has a much larger proportion of overall greenhouse gas emissions, particularly here in Southern Ontario, that a lot of people actually might believe. And so if we go into the next slide. So these are the emissions just for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. So this is like kind of around the Golden Horseshoe of Southern Ontario. And one of the interesting things is that in this particular portion of Southern Ontario, most of the emissions actually are not coming from cars. Most of the emissions are actually coming from buildings. So a lot of people, when they think about what's the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, they think about cars or transportation or airplanes and things like that. But for the communities in Southern Ontario, large chunks of it actually are coming from buildings. I can give you an example if you go to the next slide of just Toronto. Just for the city of Toronto, 54% of the emissions for the entire city comes from fossil gas. So this is a significant issue and a significant problem. Again, a lot of people think it's cars, so a lot of people think it comes from gasoline. But in reality, a lot of it comes from fossil gas, not just from the gas that's in our electrical system, but also gas from our buildings and how we heat and power our buildings as well. If we go to the next slide. So you can see here the amount of emissions that come from buildings and fossil gas varies depending on where you are. So in a place like Toronto, again, it's about 60% of emissions come from buildings. So that's where most of the fossil gas is coming in from those buildings. It's from the heating of buildings directly burning inside homes, but also from the electricity in those buildings. But if you go to a place like York Region, which is just north of Toronto, a larger chunk of those emissions actually come from transportation. But even still, in a place like that, that's a relatively more car-dependent community. A significant chunk still comes from buildings, and most of those emissions would be coming from fossil gas. So that's a significant problem. So when we're talking about fossil gas in buildings, it's primarily three areas. It's primarily for heating space, so basically heating when we burn gas in order to heat our homes. It's also for water heating, so when we heat our water, that's typically used from gas, burned from gas in Southern Ontario, and also it's from cooking. So a lot of people, not everybody, but many homes also have natural gas stoves. And natural gas, of course, is the marketing term for fossil gas. And so these have all been marketed as clean and natural, but in reality has significant health impacts when you actually burn these in your homes. There actually are very stringent venting requirements for homes when you're burning these things in your home, regardless as to whether or not it's for cooking or heating space. But a lot of people don't necessarily realize or recognize that, and so that's significant. The other area where fossil gas is being used in buildings is indirectly through electricity and how electricity is produced, and we'll be getting into that in a little bit later. Next slide. So I want to invite Ian Borsick from Environment Hamilton to talk a little bit about fossil gas from industry.
Thanks, Hossein. And a lot of what I'm talking about will feed directly into what Jack will be talking about next. But it's important to note that natural gas or fossil gas is heavily used in industry, and in the city of Hamilton, where we still are the home to the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in the province, we are continuing to see a move towards using fossil gas in industrial uses. So the image that we have on the screen right now, that's actually an image of a coke plant that is now being decommissioned at the ArcelorMittal Dofasco industrial facility here in Hamilton. And steel making is incredibly dirty. It requires an incredible amount of energy, an incredible amount of heat to create steel. And currently, and up until this point, we've been using coal. And there has been years of push to use for that use of coal to be diminished, and for industry to find a way to cleanly produce steel that doesn't impact local air quality impacts. The reality is, though, and that we've seen from research that has really started to come out in the last few years, is that while natural gas being used as a means for industrial usage is in fact better for local air quality when it comes to particulate matter that comes along with carcinogenic compounds such as sulfur dioxide, benzoate, pyrene, and other carcinogens that are found predominantly in Hamilton's airshed. natural gas or fossil gas is not actually that good for climate change. There's been some recent studies that have come out just very recently, peer-reviewed, that allege that the use of fossil gas in terms of the effect on climate change is just as bad as coal. And so what we're seeing here is a push by gas industry to be seen as that transitionary fuel that will help industry reach a net zero or carbon-free future. But the reality is that we're locking in more emissions in the short term. And in the case of methane, can be significantly more harmful than carbon emissions when it comes to the global atmosphere. Right now in the city of Hamilton, we're seeing a push for ArcelorMittal Dofasco to move towards using an electric arc furnace that will be fueled by natural gas. That gas will be provided by Enbridge via a pipeline that Enbridge will own in perpetuity. And then in the future, we are being promised that the steel industry will be then using hydrogen in the future to generate steel. We have seen some steps in Europe in other districts that have really honed in and worked out some rules about hydrogen manufacturing. So hydrogen requires a lot of energy to make before it's used as a fuel. And the EU has worked out rules about what can be actually called green hydrogen. And specifically, they can't use gas to generate green hydrogen. You can't call it green hydrogen if you're using gas to make it. Here in Canada, we don't quite have that hydrogen industry ready. We don't have the capacity locally whatsoever anywhere in the country of Canada, let alone in Ontario. And so what we're seeing now is a move towards using gas locally to produce steel, with a promise in the future that will eventually move towards hydrogen. And there's a real risk right now that we're seeing a locking in of that infrastructure and a locking in of gas being used in the industrial sector, because we know that the gas industry will want their fuel to be used for the creation of hydrogen into the future, thus not being green hydrogen as it's determined by the European Union and other districts. So it's important to flag this, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that an incredible amount of energy is needed by the industrial sector in Ontario still, so Jack will be talking about that. But I wanted to flag and very much specifically point out that what's being proposed and being heralded as a significant improvement to local air quality in the future here in a city like the city of Hamilton, it will still have overwhelming negative climate impacts, and we're not entirely sure what those next steps are and what this transitionary fuel will actually enable. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Hassan.
Thanks. And if we go to the next slide, Jack from Ontario Clean Air Alliance will be talking a lot more about gas plants and how the gas system in Southern Ontario. Jack.
Thanks, Hassan. So the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, we were established in 1997 to promote the phase out of Ontario's 5 dirty coal-fired power plants. And we worked on that issue every day for 17 years. Until the last coal plant was shut down in 2014. And now we're working on the next step to clean up Ontario's electricity grid, namely to phase out our gas-fired power plants and to move Ontario to a zero carbon electricity grid by 2030. So this slide shows the historic and forecast greenhouse gas pollution from our electric power plants, and it goes from 2005 to 2043. And the good news is that thanks to the phase out of the dirty coal plants, the greenhouse gas pollution from our electricity sector fell by 93% between 2005 and 2017. But since 2017, the pollution from our power plants has started to rise again. And the Independent Electricity System Operator is forecasting that the greenhouse gas pollution from our gas plants will rise by more than 300% by 2030 and by 700% by 2043. And if this occurs, we will lose 60% of the pollution reduction benefits that we achieved by phasing out dirty coal. So Doug Ford wants to dramatically ramp up the output and pollution of our gas plants. And to facilitate that, he also wants to build up to 1,500 megawatts of new gas-fired power plants to meet our electricity needs on the hottest, on the smoggiest summer days when our air conditioners are running full out and when the annual demand for electricity in Ontario is at its peak or at its greatest. And so to get this extra 1,500 megawatts of new gas-fired generation, Doug Ford's got a three-step process. The first step is to increase the size of 6 of our existing gas-fired power plants. And this slide lists those 6 gas plants, which Doug Ford wants to increase their size. So they're gas plants located in Toronto, in Halton Hills, in Brampton, in Thorold, in St. Clair Township near Windsor, and in King Township near Newmarket, north of Toronto. And the second step of his plan is to actually build brand new gas plants. And he's identified 2 projects so far, one in Windsor and one in St. Clair Township. And so if you look at the total megawatts from these first 2 steps, it's 570 megawatts of new gas generation. But he wants to get up to 1,500 megawatts, a lot more gas generation still. So there's a third step. So he will be in the future seeking to procure up to another 930 megawatts of new gas-fired generation. And we know that Northland Power in Thorold is going to be seeking a contract for a new 198 megawatt gas-fired peaker plant. And that's in addition to the expansion of their existing gas plant in Thorold. Now, Doug Ford's proposal to build new gas plants to meet our electricity needs on hot, smoggy summer days is climate lunacy, and it's economic lunacy, because we have cleaner and lower cost options to keep our lights on. And it's not just environmentalists like me who are saying this. It's the Royal Bank of Canada. The Royal Bank of Canada recently issued a report which said that we could completely avoid the need for new gas-fired power plants and save $500 million a year by simply investing in energy efficiency and demand management. That's the Royal Bank of Canada saying what Doug Ford's doing is just going to increase pollution and raise our electricity rates and bills. So a confirmation from the Royal Bank that this is just crazy what he's proposing to do. And in addition, the Royal Bank says we can avoid the gas plants with energy efficiency and demand management. That's absolutely true. There's also other great options. For example, we could import water power from Quebec to avoid the need for these new gas-fired power plants. Quebec's demand for electricity peaks in the winter, whereas in Ontario, it's in the summer. And that means that Quebec's got a huge surplus of water power in the summer, which they could export to Ontario and completely eliminate our need for new gas plants. Now, the Royal Bank, of course, has identified other options to avoid gas plants, new gas plants. They've suggested rooftop solar. They've suggested more energy storage, including installing bi-directional chargers so our EVs batteries can provide power back to the grid on those hot summer days and help us avoid the need for new gas plants. So why is Doug Ford proposing to build new gas plants when the Royal Bank of Canada tells us we've got much lower cost options? We could actually lower our electricity bills by not building the gas plants. Well, to answer that question, you've got to look at the large corporations that benefit from Doug Ford's policy. And the first large corporation that benefits is Ontario Power Generation, which has 5 gas-fired power plants and has the biggest fleet of gas-fired power plants in Ontario. Enbridge, which distributes gas in Ontario, obviously they will benefit. TC Energy, which brings gas to Ontario from Western Canada, they will benefit. A number of private sector power companies will benefit, like Capital Power, Northland Power, Invenergy, and Eastern Power. And then the people who drill for frack gas in Western Canada and Pennsylvania, they're going to benefit too if we build new gas-fired generation and ramp up our use of fossil gas to keep our lights on. So now I want to turn about how we can work together to stop Doug Ford's proposal plans to build new gas-fired generation. And we've got a three-pronged strategy. And the first prong is focused at the municipal level. Now, according to Ontario's Energy Minister, Todd Smith, new gas plants can only be built in a municipality if the municipality passes a resolution approving the new gas plant, the new gas-fired generation. So the first thing we need to do is we need to ask the local municipalities where these gas plants are proposed to be built or expanded to pass resolutions saying they don't want gas plants, they don't want new gas-fired generation in their community. Now, the good news is the City of Toronto has already passed a resolution saying they don't want the Portland's gas plant on the Toronto waterfront expanded. That's the good news. The bad news is that it appears the government of Ontario is not listening and still wants to move ahead with expanding the Portland's gas-fired power plant. So what we have to do is we have to get as many municipalities as possible to pass resolutions saying no to new gas-fired generation. And then we've got to put pressure on Energy Minister Todd Smith to keep his promise to not build new gas-fired generation in municipalities that don't want it. So the second prong of our strategy is to get help from Prime Minister Trudeau. We're asking the federal government to issue clean electricity regulations to prohibit the building of new gas-fired generation in Ontario. And as you may know, Trudeau has promised to move all of Canada to a net zero carbon electricity grid by 2035. So if you're going to do that, then it makes absolutely no sense to be building new gas plants. What you should be doing now is investing in energy efficiency and renewables. So we're asking Prime Minister Trudeau to issue these clean electricity regulations to prohibit the building of new gas plants in Ontario. And I'm pleased to note that the Toronto City Council has passed a resolution requesting the Prime Minister to do this too. Now we turn to the third prong of our strategy, and that is an appeal to Jagmeet Singh and the NDP for help. So far, Trudeau hasn't issued these clean electricity regulations to prohibit new gas plants. But Jagmeet Singh and the NDP can help us, because as you know, it's the NDP that is keeping Trudeau and the federal government in power. And that gives them incredible political leverage. So we're asking Jagmeet Singh to use his political leverage to persuade Prime Minister Trudeau to issue clean electricity regulations to prohibit the building of new gas plants in Ontario. So for our three-pronged strategy to work, we need the help of everyone in this call and local environmental groups across Ontario to help build a public support for stopping this new gas-fired generation. And so the Ontario Clean Air Alliance will do whatever it can to help local groups build support for stopping the gas plants. And things we could do to help you could be, for example, we have a pamphlet about the Portland's gas plant in Toronto and why it doesn't make sense. We could modify that pamphlet to address the absurdity of the proposed gas plant in your community. We also have a new mode messaging system that allows you to ask your supporters to send email messages to municipal, provincial, or federal politicians. And we could let you use that message system to get our message out. And we could also help you with graphic design for your social media messaging. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. That's really helpful and really informative. Jack's been fantastic in this continued work, and for me to understand a little bit more about like what municipalities can do and what cities can do to help reduce and eliminate the fossil gas issue from these provincial system and these provincial rules and regulations and these projects that the province wants to put up as well. So we're now opening up into the Q&A session right now. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A section. The Q&A section can be seen by us, but it can't actually be seen by any of the participants right now. It's just a little functionality in the system that we didn't turn on for this webinar. So if you have any questions, please by all means ask. One of the first things that it's just, I guess, like a data point. Roger Abbott is asking, can you point us to the Royal Bank report stating all this about the alternate plan available to us instead of fossil gas plants? Are you able to do that, Jack?
Well, yes, the Royal Bank of Canada report is called Power Shift. So for example, if you Google Royal Bank and Power Shift, it'll pop up.
Great, thank you. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. One question that's that's being asked right now is, given that the Portland's gas plant expansion contract has already been awarded, do we know how long it might take for the expansion to be online?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure the contract is actually being signed yet. And second of all, even if it has been signed, it could easily be cancelled because Ontario Power Generation is owned by the Government of Ontario. So there'll be no cancellation fees. And I'm not sure exactly how quickly Ontario Power Generation thinks they can expand the size of the Portland's gas plant. But I suspect they're planning to do it by 2027 or maybe earlier.
Great. One of the questions that I have for my colleague Ian as well is, and what can municipalities do to help reduce, if not eliminate fully, the use of fossil gas in industry?
Yeah, and I also saw the question about municipalities where there is no gas plant being proposed, and that includes municipalities like us here in Hamilton and in Ottawa. This is something that I have talked about with local councillors here in the city of Hamilton. We have the unique fossil gas problem that I laid out before. But I think, ultimately, and Jack, maybe you can speak to this a little bit more after me. I think it's incredibly important for all municipalities to speak out on issues that are not just directly affecting their municipalities. We see a lot of issues across from this provincial government with land use planning, with energy, with road and all the greenbelt grabs we've seen. And I think it's incredibly important for municipalities to weigh in. And on the electricity use piece, the solutions that Jack laid out for us can be adopted and used in the city of Hamilton to reduce the load on the grid and reduce the need for these new gas plants. So I would say yes, municipalities, even if there is nothing planned, they should be saying that they don't want to see more gas plants in the province of Ontario generally.
I can also add to that for the city of Toronto, at least, when we're talking about building emissions, the city of Toronto has a net zero by 2040 plan. We will not be able to reach that if the electricity from the grid and the emissions from that grid keeps going up. So even if Toronto did not have the Portland's gas plant, it would still be something that would be of interest for the city of Toronto, because if the emissions from the grid goes up, we just simply can't reach our net zero goals at all. So, so this does still affect directly municipalities without those gas plants, and so that's a pretty good argument to be made if you live in one of those municipalities and is organizing around that to push for that locally.
Yeah, and if I can just add, so far 34 municipalities across Ontario that represent almost 60% of Ontario's population have passed resolutions calling for the phase out of gas-fired power for electricity generation. And that includes the city of Hamilton and the city of Ottawa, as well as many other cities. And so you could certainly ask your municipal council to pass a resolution requesting the government of Ontario to phase out gas-fired power by 2030 if your municipality hasn't already done so.
One of the questions that we have here is, I live in the Niagara region and close to the Thorold cogeneration plant. I've spoken to my local MPP and regional councillor about this issue. Are there any local groups that exist in the Niagara region that I can connect with?
Yes, there are local groups, and there is one local citizen, Mark Freeman, who are very actively working to stop the Thorold plant. And if you were to email me at jack@cleanairalliance.org, I could put you in touch with them.
Ian mentioned recent peer-reviewed research showing roughly equivalent climate impacts between coal and fossil gas. Was this specifically for industrial uses or for other scenarios? And can you share more info and links? Thank you.
Yes, I'm just going to retrieve the link right now. I maybe should have had that ready to go before. But this was for electricity generation, I believe. It was looking at gas plants, specifically for electricity generation, not necessarily for industrial use. You know, yeah, I mean, frankly, the trade-offs with the industrial use are there, but ultimately at the same time, these new gas plants are very much being proposed to support electricity consumption, while at the same time, the unique situation we find ourselves in Hamilton is that gas is being used to fuel an electric arc furnace that will be then used to create steel instead of the use of burning coal. So while it may generate local air quality improvements, as I laid out before, it's just as harmful when it comes to, you know, methane in the atmosphere is methane in the atmosphere. It doesn't matter how it gets there or what have you, it has the same effect. And I'm just going to retrieve that link and I will get it to you.
Yeah, I also wanted to add to that as well is one of the main reasons why the climate impact of gas is so high is because in its natural state, fossil gas itself is the greenhouse gas that's 20 plus times more potent than carbon dioxide. That is not the case for some of these other fossil fuels. For example, gasoline. Gasoline is in its natural state, doesn't produce significant amounts of greenhouse gases. You actually have to burn it first. And that's not the case with fossil gas. And so the process of extracting that gas, there's a lot of leakage. And the process of distributing that gas, there's a lot of leakage. And when you account for all that leakage, I've seen studies that show that that's why the total greenhouse effect of fossil gas is so high. But ultimately, the way that carbon accounting works is oftentimes that carbon accounting doesn't account for all that leakage. And so it seems once it comes to your house, you light the fossil gas. Yes, it's true. The greenhouse gases that comes from those emissions once you've lit it is relatively low compared to burning coal, but it doesn't account for all the gas that's leaked out of the system before it actually gets into your house. And that's an carbon accounting quirk, and one of those carbon accounting quirks that marketing companies and oil and gas companies are using to argue that this is a quote unquote clean fuel or quote unquote less carbon intensive fuel. Kathleen Owens asking, Windsor City Council has approved a new gas plant. What can we do to combat this? Maybe this is something Derek and Jack can go into.
Sure. So the approval was back in January, and it was an 8-2 vote at City Council. And in the subsequent months, my organization has talked to several councillors about this, both those in favor and those in opposition. And the position of those councillors are fairly entrenched. The issue, of course, is now whether Capital Power will, in fact, the proponent will, in fact, proceed with its project. And in terms of pressure points, I think what we see is not so much pressure points at the political level anymore at the municipal council, but the possibility that, in fact, the contract may not go forward. That's always a possibility. I'm sure Jack has more comments on that.
Well, I would just add that to stop the Windsor gas plant, given that the Windsor City Council has endorsed the gas plant, we really need to put pressure on Prime Minister Trudeau to issue those clean electricity regulations to prohibit the plant from being built.
Canada is very interesting, I find, because it really is kind of like a top-down system, whereas like that's not the same thing in the United States. And so it's one of the difficulties that we have with Toronto Environment Alliance is that cities are oftentimes, are legally under the Constitution children of the province, but also the provinces are children of the federal government in some issues, not all issues, but clean air is one of those issues where they share jurisdiction. So that's where that legal power comes from, as I understand it. So Anne is asking, in building a coalition to support Ford's gas plant, has there been outreach to healthcare and public health groups, local renewable energy businesses, organizations, and businesses involved in construction and retrofitting and energy efficiency?
Well, certainly we've done outreach to those groups, but certainly more needs to be done. We need to definitely expand the coalition, and anything that people on this call can do to help us get more health groups to support us, and people who are in the renewable energy business or the energy conservation business, that would be fantastic.
I'll also just throw in there that we did mention it before, but this is all happening within a context of several years ago, Doug Ford canceled a variety of renewable energy projects earlier in his first term. And so, you know, we had industry locally that was ready to start building the type of electricity generation that we needed, and then it was canceled to save money, and we were told, oh, it's not needed because we got off coal, and now, you know, a few years later we have these gas plant proposals. So I think, you know, that question is getting to the point where there is private, you know, enterprise that was ready to go and start building this electricity generation for what we do need here in Ontario in terms of generation, and that was canceled before these gas plants were then brought online or brought online to be proposed. So it's really important to flag that as the context that we're in right now.
One organization that I know quite well is CAPE, which is the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. They are actually doctors, and they have been doing a lot of work on gas in general, not necessarily so much on gas plants, but they do have a significant campaign targeting fossil gas. Well, oftentimes they're talking about the health impacts of burning it inside your own home, but there are other aspects of the campaign as well, and they are kind of part of this constellation of organizations that are working with us, and they're a great group. Corey's asking, can you speak to the increased electrical costs that homeowners and even industry may be faced from the fossil gas expansion plan? This is something that likely will resonate with many people who are already finding it difficult to make ends meet.
I'll jump in on this first. Here locally in the city of Hamilton and in the city of Burlington, our neighbor just over, recently approved, and they're moving forward with pilot programs to implement home energy retrofits, and very specifically getting folks off gas. So the city of Hamilton will be doing a pilot of helping 20 to 50 homeowners change their house over from having a furnace to an electric air heat pump. That will be paired with some air sealing as well. And the purpose of that is to essentially, the selling point for that for the city of Hamilton is to reduce people's electricity bills, specifically their electricity from gas. And there's a lot of houses that have extremely out-of-date furnaces that replaced with an electric heat pump will be significantly cheaper for them in the long run when it comes to utility bills. But the real problem that we have here in the province of Ontario and Canada more widely, that up until just a few years ago, I wasn't completely aware of, and I've really come to realize it, is how integrated Enbridge is in how we, think about home energy use. For a lot of the grants that are afforded by the federal government, you have to be an Enbridge customer to apply for them, because a lot of these grants don't necessarily go for getting you off gas. It goes to getting you to conserve more gas and not use as much and have an upgraded furnace and the likes there. Enbridge also needs to seek provincial approval before they raise rates, and they've done that already. They sought out provincial approval to raise rates for the explicit purpose of expansion of infrastructure. They needed to pay for an expansion of their infrastructure so that way they can continue to provide gas to these gas plants, to people's homes and the like there. So when we're talking about increased costs, we are talking about locking in infrastructure and locking in fees that are pre-approved and that Enbridge wants to keep in there forever. Once these pipelines are laid down and they're in the ground, it will be extremely difficult to then tear them up. The financial incentive is there to keep them where they're at. And that's what these gas companies across the world want to ensure that remains in place. And so when we're talking about reducing prices and things like that, I think we're going to see significantly more interest over the coming years, especially as cities continue to move forward with these retrofit programs of getting people off gas and seeing how much more affordable it can be, not relying on gas to heat your home every winter and the like there. When it comes to electricity generation, I mean, it's already been in there with regards to the increased rates and how that'll happen, but I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on that.
The gas-fired peaker plants that Doug Ford wants to build are incredibly expensive. They're more than 3 times the cost of wind and solar electricity. They're more than 10 times the cost of energy efficiency and conservation. So what he's proposing to do will just push up our electricity rates. Whereas if instead he was to invest in energy efficiency and wind and solar, our electricity rates and our electricity bills will go down. So what he's doing is just not in the best interests of Ontario homeowners.
Yeah, and one thing that I'd like to add as well is the actual infrastructure for gas itself is very expensive. So all the pipelines and things like that. The Toronto Star had done a calculator and said, if you were to get off gas completely, what would your savings be? And it turns out that if you were to completely get off gas, a large chunk of your savings from your bill is actually no longer having to pay for the fee that Enbridge charges you for having that connection into the gas line into your house to begin with. So every time Enbridge builds a $100 or $200 or $500 million pipeline, that is not public money going into it. That's actually being distributed throughout everybody who's already paying gas. And when you cut your house off of gas and when you cut your system off of gas, you are no longer paying into that system. And so that's one of the challenges there as well in terms of communicating with things, because oftentimes people just look at the price of gas itself because they've actually looked, the price of gas as a portion of your bill is getting increasingly smaller, especially as the gas infrastructure gets older and Enbridge tries to keep upgrading it over and over time. So you have to think of this gas pipeline system like roads. They eventually degrade and they get expensive to replace. And maybe we shouldn't do that anymore. There's one more question from Chris Taggart, and then we're going to go into some thank yous. From Chris Taggart, what's the best way for specific local groups, example, all of Ottawa, to connect and organize around this and adjacent issues? Is there a Slack group or something? And this, maybe I can direct this to Alice, Irene.
Great. Thanks for the question, Chris. So I'll start with the adjacent issues part and then about this issue in particular. And this is something that we're really excited about with the Urban Climate Alliance is how do we organize within our cities and then feed into provincial movements, for example, and make sure that all of our cities are connecting between us. So that's part of the purpose of this alliance. In terms of in Ottawa itself, so for adjacent issues, one of the most, as you know, it's People's Officials Plan Coalition, just for anyone on the call, and it's a way that many groups 25 plus can connect and organize, can coordinate around specific moments or specific pushes. So that's very effective and has proven effective for adjacent issues. In terms of this issue in particular, it might be worth having a specific meeting on it and seeing which groups want to engage on this. And Ecology Ottawa would be happy to convene that and see how we can, for example, support with the provincial calls to action that Jack mentioned, as well as the national ones as well, both with Jagmeet Singh and Trudeau, and that call for the CER. So Jack, I don't know if you want anything that you wanted to add, but that's something that for our city, at least, we'd be happy to convene a meeting on that and see if we need a Slack group or something, but not sure if any of the other cities wanted to weigh in, or Jack as well.
Well, no, I agree with what you've said, and we'll certainly be willing to participate and help out.
Thanks. And I know you had some great tools there that people can use for that, even without convening that right off the bat. So we'll, I'm sure, share those after the call as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add there is an increasingly tighter and tighter knit group of people and organizations that are coming together on the gas issue and on the multiple aspects around gas. And there's a lot more organizations, even at the national level, NGOs, that are starting to realize that this is a good place to fight gas in Southern Ontario. So there's a lot more resources coming into Southern Ontario from the NGO side. So I do expect that we'll be seeing more and more of this. And Toronto Environmental Alliance, where we haven't historically spent a lot of time fighting gas projects to this extent, and increasingly it looks like that is something that we will be doing, and looking forward to working with everybody here on this call in stopping fossil gas across the province and hopefully everywhere. Okay, I think that's about it. Thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate everyone being here. Thank you very much to Ian and Jack and Alice, Irene and Derek. Also, I want to thank Jessica, who is in the background moving the slides and making sure questions are answered and things like that. So if you're in Toronto, and maybe we can just like spend a little time here so people have some time to write this down. I can start, if you want to go to torontoenvironment.org, that's where you can go. You can also email me directly at howsen, which is spelled on your screen, HOW-SEN @torontoenvironment.org. You can also reach me on all of the social media channels, of which there are now like 4 times more as there used to be, at Howsen Chong, and that's no hyphens, no spaces. And why don't I just like go over across my screen? Ian, you want to give folks your contact information?
Yeah, so anyone can find us at environmenthamilton.org. Just shared it in the chat there. You can also find my email there, which is my first initial and last name, iborsic at environmenthamilton.org as well. You can find that on our website.
Jack?
Yeah, my email address is jack@cleanairalliance.org. You can also go to our website, cleanairalliance.org, and a message will pop up asking you to sign up for our electronic newsletter.
Alice, Irene?
Thanks. So you can go to ecologyottawa.ca and you'll be able to subscribe just right there on the homepage or in the footer. Or if you want, ecologyottawa.ca/home_subscribe, if you want to go straight there. And my email is aliceirene.whttaker@ecologyottawa.ca. Please feel free to reach out, especially that last question there about Ottawa and bringing the Ottawa groups together. So feel free to reach out.
Derek?
Citizensenvironmentalliance.org is our access point for our email newsletter. And my email is derek@citizensenvironmentalliance.org.
Thank you, everybody, for coming here. Thanks again to the Echo Foundation for supporting our work. And thanks again to Jess for doing all the background work here. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Have a great weekend. Hope you stay safe during this hot summer. And we will see you all soon.